All right, we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we approach some key milestones in the rule process for the state's minimum standards for public school approval, we're offering this briefing to inform the public on where the rules stand and where the process is at this moment. First, a brief background. My name is Christina Pretorius. I'm the policy director with Reaching Higher New Hampshire. I'm joined by our director of public relations, Kelly Unteat, who will be helping monitor the chat and will be facilitating the Q&A at the end. If you have any questions as we go through these slides, because it will be a lot, please drop them into the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. We did try to leave some space for some Q&A. This session is also being recorded. We recognize that this is a really busy time of year, and so we will be recording this presentation and putting it on YouTube so that folks can watch it again, watch it later, and we'll also be publishing the PowerPoint slides. So a little bit about Reaching Higher New Hampshire. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to ensure that policymakers, community leaders, families, school leaders have the insights that they need to make informed decisions and increase access to high-quality public education here in New Hampshire. We serve as a resource to decision makers, providing data, analysis, and research to advance high-quality public education in the state, which we do through briefings like this, webinars, social media resources, strategic consulting, a number of other things. We have some examples here on the slide, but if you're interested in learning more about what we do, please feel free to contact us. Our email addresses will be there at the end, and it's also on our website. So let's start with laying some groundwork. What are the minimum standards for public school approval? I know a lot of folks probably are familiar with them. This has been a process that's been underway for 3 or 4 years now, but just so that we're all on the same track. You may have heard the minimum standards for public school approval being called several things, the ED 306s, the public school approval standards, or quite simply the 306s. They are the set of administrative rules that govern all public schools in New Hampshire. They serve as the foundation for all New Hampshire's public schools. In order to be approved to operate here in the state, they must adhere to these rules, which cover a number of different critical topics. And what's really important to keep in mind as we go through this briefing is this. These minimum standards have served as a mandate for what schools must provide for students, regardless of where they attend school. They traditionally really haven't outlined what students are supposed to know and be able to do. Those are different. Those are academic standards. The minimum standards set out what a school has to offer. And that's important because of their real purpose. They determine what makes a public school a public school. They set standards so that all public schools are operating by the same rules. They ensure that all students, regardless of the school that they attend, are receiving a consistent education. And they also serve as a foundation for the public school funding formula. Our existing funding formula integrates the minimum standards requirements, whether that's maximum class size, staff qualifications, the type of courses that schools have to offer. And the minimum standards really serve as a very important framework for the state's expectation of what they have to fund. Because what they say schools must have, the state has to fund that. So starting off with a list of the sections of the minimum standards. And I'm not going to read all of these. It is very extensive. The minimum standards themselves are scores of pages long. They're like 70, 80 pages once you get them all printed out. But you can really see here how extensive they are. They range from required school board policies to policies around school culture and climate, staff qualifications, curriculum requirements. They also include core structures for content areas like math, like English, like science, like art. And the minimum standards are really the state's way of saying, this is what we want our public schools to be. These rules are really the vision for what public schools in New Hampshire are. And so they do serve a number of different purposes. They ensure that all students in New Hampshire receive a consistent education, regardless of which public school they attend, whether that's in the North Country, whether that's in the southwestern part of the state, whether that's in the capital region. All schools in New Hampshire are playing by the same rules. They set statewide requirements for New Hampshire high school graduates, the number of credits that's required to graduate from high school, and what those credit areas are. And they also set requirements for the state's obligation to fund public schools. And this is a critically important one for a number of reasons, not least of which the state is currently under 2 different lawsuits around the state funding formula with claims of inadequate school funding. A state court has found that New Hampshire is underfunding its public schools by over $500 million per year, every single year. And so, what the state says that schools must have is what they are required to fund. And so when those standards may be diluted, it may be walking back the state's obligation in terms of how much they have to fund public schools. And that's really important for a lot of the pieces that we're going to be talking about today. So you may have heard quite a bit about the minimum standards for public school approval, the New Hampshire Department of Education's overhaul of them. Every 10 years, these rules have to be updated. And that process here began in early 2021, technically late 2020. But we've been underway of this process for several years now. The New Hampshire Department of Education has been pursuing a significant overhaul of these minimum standards. We're about halfway to 3/4 of the way through this rulemaking process, and we've found that the changes here could redefine the vision and role of public schools in New Hampshire. This has been a long process. We've found that throughout the process, whether it was in the beginning when we first started seeing what was coming out of the department, to really up until now at this point, that Granite Staters have been overwhelmingly opposed to them. Earlier this April, over 200 people voiced concerns that they would undermine public schools and lower standards for students. An initial legal review showed significant concerns with the rules, that they were in conflict with existing laws, they were contrary to legislative intent, they were not in the best interest of the public, or they were unclear. Those were some of the pieces of feedback that they had received. But really, despite these concerns, the department and the State Board of Education are continuing to pursue the overhaul of these standards. So when we look at some of the outstanding concerns, right, because these rules have gone through a number of different phases, and we are talking right now about the rule proposal that is in play at the moment. Half of it is in front of one of the legislative committees. The other half we're expecting to go before the legislative committee in November. And so this is based on the latest available draft or latest available proposal of these minimum standards. And so diving into some of the specific concerns that we've been hearing, it's from expanding the definition of educator throughout the rules, which is something that we see impact throughout the entire document, removing maximum class sizes, eliminating content area standards, unilaterally changing the required credits for graduation, removing school facilities from the rules, and more. So we're going to dive into some of these specifics. We're not going to cover them all. If there are particular ones that we don't cover and you want to learn more about them, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or shoot me an email, and I'm happy to meet up with you and talk with you about it. So first, we're going to talk about expanding the definition of educator. This is one of the most consistent concerns we've heard. It has been a concern really for months now. So the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposed rules expands the definition of educator to now include paraeducators, educational interpreters, school nurses, and, quote, any other individuals credentialed by the state board. Current rule, what's in place right now and what schools currently operate on, defines educator as a certified teacher, but the proposed overhaul expands that definition dramatically. And it has a number of kind of cascading effects throughout the minimum standards. One of the key pieces that this has been raised concerns around is through the expanded definitions in staff qualifications, right? So under current rules right now, the superintendents are able to assign teachers, certified teachers with sufficient content knowledge to a content area in which they are not licensed, as long as they're teaching less than 50% of the individual weekly hours of instruction. So you see right here, this is pretty much consistent. So this is in the proposed rule, but it's pretty consistent with current rule. But where we see this significant change is in the definition of educator, right? So if we were to take the proposed definition of educator and apply it to this rule, it really appears to change the requirement significantly. So just as an example, let's say when we're thinking about educator in the proposed rule, we're thinking about a paraeducator, right? And so if we replace educator here in this rule with paraeducator, let's think of an 8th grade pre-algebra course. We'd now see this as a paraprofessional with sufficient content knowledge may be assigned to teach in a content area in which they are not licensed. And so we see that this is significantly different than a certified teacher that has sufficient content knowledge, which is how the rule exists now. So we've been hearing some pushback from a number of folks, mainly at the department. We've been hearing secondhand that, this isn't what they meant and those kinds of things. But really what's extremely important is that how unclear this is, right? We're seeing the backup for this being, oh, well, that's not what we meant. What we meant is this. But when we're looking at rules, we have to think about what they actually say. That's really what matters. And that's what's going to hold up, not, kind of backhand conversations of, well, this is what it means and that kind of thing. Those are very different. And so if there's ambiguity in the rules themselves, it creates significant problems when these rules are implemented and in practice among school districts. So it's really important that they're clear, and the level of ambiguity here makes these rules, it introduces a lot of problems, and it could lead to some significant confusion in the field. So one of the other areas that has had significant concerns is in the removal of maximum class sizes. So this has been a conversation among lawmakers, among the public for genuinely years now, right? Under existing rules, the New Hampshire has maximum class sizes. A kindergarten class cannot be more than 25 students. A 4th grade class cannot be more than 30 students. The New Hampshire Department of Education's rule proposal would shift that very concrete maximum class size to a student educator ratio. So this is the fact that we're moving to a ratio is very different in practice than a maximum class size. And I think it will be easiest to kind of look at this as an example. So under current rule, you have 300 middle school students, right? You have a body of 300 middle school students. We see that right here. You have to have 10 classes, a minimum of 10 classes, because no classroom can have more than 30 students, right? Just that is black and white. It's in the rules. No more than 30 students per classroom. One certified classroom teacher per class, right? Doesn't matter if there's other staff there. There could be paraprofessionals there. There could be educational interpreters there in the classroom. It doesn't matter. The class size cannot be more than 30 students. With the shift to educator ratio, though, now we're introducing a formula, right? That we can see that, if a school of 300 middle school students has classroom teachers, 3 paraeducators, a school nurse, a principal, an assistant principal, and a superintendent, right? Now, if we introduce that formula, we can see that we can actually have up to classes of about 100 kids, which sounds really hyperbolic, but stick with me for a minute, okay? So we have heard time and time again at State Board of Education meetings that this would give schools significant flexibility in how they can staff their schools. We've heard examples from the State Board and from the Department of Education where, hey, maybe now high schools can have college lecture style courses that prepare students for higher education. What they mean is large classrooms in an auditorium. We've heard those examples very specifically. This would be a huge departure from the current maximum class size that we have right now. I also want to note that one of the recent public school applications requested a waiver of the maximum class size in order to have more students per class because they didn't have enough educators for their online course. So moving to a ratio model would give them more flexibility for those much larger class sizes. And so from moving to a concrete maximum class size to this ratio, it really puts a lot of ambiguity, and frankly, it raises a lot of questions in terms of how is this going to happen right now if this were adopted today? What does that mean for our public schools? What does that mean for our school boards in making these decisions? And what does it mean for our school funding formula? Because if you look at our school funding formula, if you look at all of the reports and all of the back work that's been done to create that formula, that our formula is really based on these maximum class sizes. And so to move to a ratio, that there's a big question on what the impact would be. So one of the other areas that we have been hearing some pretty significant concerns of over the past couple of years, and even with the latest iteration of these rules, is the elimination of content area standards. So right here, you have two columns. One is the existing rule. That's what schools operate under right now. And then one is the New Hampshire Department of Education's proposed rule. And you can see how they're pretty different. So under existing rules, the rules state that local school boards shall require that an arts program provides systemic and sequential instruction, planned curriculum that's consistent with state law, sound assessment practices. And under 2 out of 3 of these subheadings, there is quite a bit of detail of what consists of systemic and sequential instruction. What does planned curriculum mean? So it gives schools quite a bit of detail in terms of what they have to offer. What we're seeing is a movement towards the requirement that a local school board shall ensure that a program be consistent with local competencies, be aligned with curriculum and competencies aligned to state frameworks. In this case, from 2001, which right now it's 2024, so that's 23 years ago, and adhere to sound assessment practices. And really, that's it. That's the only detail that we have in the new content area standards. So we're seeing really a stripping of the detail around what schools have to offer. So I do want to quickly show you, this is for arts education program. I am not going to read this, but I did want to do a screenshot to show the detail that is required currently under an arts program, right? So creating, performing, and responding with understanding, relating various types of arts knowledge and skills within the content of arts across other disciplines, right? There's a lot of requirements here to ensure that an arts program in a public school is complete and it's robust. But we're seeing a lot of this detail being stripped away, which has, really unclear, we're not sure what the impact of this is going to be for a number of reasons. One, what will one program look like from one school to the next? Because if there's no requirements in terms of what the inputs have to be, like how much will this differ district to district? But also, one of the things that we've seen raised is the concerns around what the state has to fund. So these content area standards are really one of the biggest areas where those school funding concerns come into play. So state law, the minimum standards shall constitute an opportunity for the delivery of an adequate education. That is the purpose of the minimum standards, to talk about the delivery. And under current rules, the state outlines the required inputs. That's the systemic and sequential instruction. That's the planned curriculum. That's the sound assessment practices that a school must provide. So we're talking about input-based, right? A school, regardless of where they are in a state, has to offer X, Y, and Z. But what we're seeing is a shift, a huge shift to public schools have to ensure access to programs, and really kind of shifting to, instead of saying, what a school has to provide, now we're saying what a student must learn. And, there's a lot of confusion in the public with content experts around why are they making that shift? What is the purpose of that shift? And what is the impact of that shift going to be? Because right now, we're saying this is what a school has to provide, and we're moving to this is what a student must learn. And it doesn't say how exactly a school has to get there. There's a lot of confusion in terms of what will be required of schools under these rules. And therefore, what a school has to provide, what a school board is responsible to providing for their schools, and what the state is responsible providing to fund those schools. So I do just want to take a moment to kind of tie a bow in that, because it is such a critical piece. The elimination of those content area standards, the gutting of those content area standards. I'm sure folks remember a couple of years ago in 2022, what happened at the Croydon school district, where they slashed their budget, and really it left the community with little more to do than have, they didn't have many options. And the school board had said, oh, using micro schools, using Prenda pods, those kinds of things. The community pushed back. And one of the reasons that we've heard that they were able to push back was because of the minimum standards and those content area standards. A micro school does not have the same robust requirements that are required in those content area standards. And so, if we eliminate those content area standards, what does it mean for what school boards are responsible to offer? One of the other areas that we are seeing some pretty significant concern over, and the most recently, this was in one of the legislative oversight committees, some lawmakers had expressed some pretty substantial concerns with expanding the definition of ELOs. So ELOs are extended learning opportunities. They are currently a very specific type of program that's offered in New Hampshire public schools. They are opportunities for students to learn outside of the classroom and earn credit for experiences like internships, apprenticeships, independent study, other kinds of experiences. They're really a partnership between the school, the family, and an out-of-school classroom partner, whether that's a local business. We've seen, police departments, fire departments, local veterinary organizations. They are just tremendous opportunities for students. We have an entire page on our website that's dedicated to ELOs. They are really cool. They get national recognition, New Hampshire's model. What's really important about them, though, one of the big key pieces of them is that certified teachers in the student's school help the student with the design of the ELO. So the student gets to design it with input from a certified teacher. The teacher ensures student safety and ensures that the student is meeting learning targets. There are requirements for assessment, for portfolios, for all of those kinds of things to make sure that the student is meeting those learning targets. The new proposed definition, however, appears to dilute what an ELO is. We've heard a lot of concerns that the new rule removes some of the basic protections for students, including the critical role of certified educators, ensuring that students are learning what they're supposed to. We've heard from a few legislative oversight committee members just last week that this could really open up the door into what counts as an ELO. There was a concern that, PragerU courses could count as ELOs and things like that. And so there are just a lot of concerns in this expanded definition, and it's something that is being talked about quite a bit in a number of spaces. So getting to kind of very particular pieces, and these have to do with high school requirements. The proposal removes the outline of courses that high schools must offer. So this is really critical, especially when we talk about access to courses and school funding. So right now, you can see in this table, high schools across New Hampshire are required to offer, for example, 3 art classes. 3 business education classes. So this sets out what a high school has to offer. They can offer more if they would like, if they feel that they have to, but this is the bare minimum in terms of what they have to provide, right? This ensures that students have access to enough course options to meet their graduation requirements and requires the state to fund a basic set of course offerings, right? So we see in the school funding formula that this is a requirement that they have to fund these kinds of things. But the proposed rules completely remove this requirement. Now the only requirement that a school offers is 43 courses across the required program areas, but it gives schools significant flexibility in terms of how they meet those requirements. The New Hampshire Department of Education has repeatedly encouraged what they call interdisciplinary learning, which is something that schools do right now. It is a pretty common practice, but there is concern that could mean that some of these required program areas, those courses could be combined and standalone courses could be eliminated. So there are some significant questions that are being raised of, if you infuse some art in a math course, for instance, could you remove your arts education program? That is a question that we are hearing quite a bit, especially in light of some previous legislation that's been proposed. There have been significant longstanding concerns around whether courses like art, whether courses like PE, health, and world languages would really be part of a robust public education here. There have been efforts to kind of have them take a back seat. And so this is one of the places as well where we're seeing the potential for some concerns here. And so this table is being removed. And so, it's unclear what schools will have to offer and what the state will be required to fund. And so in the same light, this is a little different, but in the same light, we're seeing unilateral changes in graduation requirements. So the minimum standards for public school approval are where the state sets out that in order to graduate from high school, you have to accumulate 20 credits. And it also states what those credits are. So under current law, under current rules, a student needs a half a credit in arts education, 4 credits in English, 1 credit in US and New Hampshire history, all 6 open electives, all of those kinds of things. School boards can set higher ones if they'd like, but these are the minimum. This is universal across public schools in New Hampshire. We're seeing the State Board of Education make some pretty substantial changes in these required credits. I won't have you read them because in this slide, I actually note out what has changed. So we're seeing that the English requirement has been reduced by a half a credit. There's a new credit requirement for a half credit in data analysis and statistics under mathematics. And perhaps the largest change is that we're seeing an increase in social studies credit requirements from 3 credits to 5. And so that is a pretty significant change. We're also seeing students have to have a half a credit in logic and rhetoric and a half a credit in personal finance literacy in order to graduate. And we're seeing the open electives reduced to 4 to accommodate these increased credits in these very specific areas. So specifically with the logic and rhetoric and personal finance literacy, we've seen lawmakers raise concerns that that's been outside of legislative intent because state law is very specific that logic and rhetoric and personal finance literacy can be integrated in other courses. But what the state board is doing is requiring a specific half credit course in each of those areas. It's also important to note that there's been quite a bit of discussion among the state board around exactly what they want these to look like. And in a couple of previous meetings, they have discussed revisiting this, adopting the minimum standards as they are, and then revisiting it in the future to kind of to shift it around some more. But we've gone through all of the public comment that the department and the state board have received. We've gone through all of the public comment that's available on the minimum standards, and we didn't really see any requests for any of these changes. And so One of the things that we're hearing is, where did this idea come from? What's the purpose of it, and that kind of thing. So that's something else that we're seeing as pretty substantial. One of the other things to note here is that this would take effect not this upcoming school year, but the school year after. So it does have a little bit of lag time, but this is the proposed change that's in the minimum standards. So when we take all of these changes together, what are some of the outcomes that we might expect? We see that the standards really would shift the purpose of public schools from places of high quality and effective teaching and learning to really kind of credit approving centers where educators and schools kind of have little control over the quality and depth of the curriculum and instruction. We see that in a number of areas. We see that in the change to student-teacher ratio. We see that in the expansion of the definition of educator. We see that in the change of definition of extended learning opportunities and a number of other areas. We also see that it could open the door to privatization through unbundling. And that's where private and for-profit companies could come in, they could step in, and they could kind of sell pieces of school, right? Whether those are courses or learning opportunities, whether they're co-curricular activities or other critical pieces of student school experiences. In reading them and in hearing the concerns, this is something that we are watching pretty closely. It's also not unique to New Hampshire. These efforts are happening in a number of other states as well. And so this is something that we are watching really, really closely. And, we're seeing that it could have really troubling implications for the future of public education and public school funding in New Hampshire, especially where we're undergoing two major school funding lawsuits at the same time simultaneously. Thinking about changing the minimum standards in which they are kind of founded upon, that is raising a lot of questions as well. So I wanted to go into a little bit around public feedback. What have we seen so far? And then what can we expect for the next steps? So we've observed over the past 3 or 4 years, overwhelming public opposition to these rules. In April, during the public hearing, the state board received over 200 statements of opposition to the rules, notably, and our team read every single piece of comment that was made available from the public. We couldn't find any supportive statements, right? We read them all. They were all in opposition. In addition, content area experts have provided detailed feedback on the content area standards, but we haven't seen those comments be incorporated into the proposal, right? We're seeing educators, content area experts stand up and say like, hey, I'm seeing some real concerns here. I need more information on why you made this change. This doesn't make sense to me. But those and offering actual replacement language, but we're not seeing that incorporated as well. We're seeing lawmakers raise concerns through oversight committees and in legislation over the past several years. There has been legislation to attempt to help to influence the process. So we've seen that engagement too, and we've also seen quite a bit of engagement from school leaders and the public really continue to raise concerns about the potential impacts, even since that April public hearing. I do want to share one quote from one of the educators during the review sessions that really struck out. And this educator said that they don't see how the changes to the rules improve education at all. Instead, they seem to broaden the scope of what might be considered education without clear guidelines, policies, or structures. And this feedback was really stark because not only did we see this idea be repeated in a lot of other different places from a lot of other different people, but when we think about the purpose of the rules, this was really striking, right? So when this goes to oversight committees who look to see whether these rules can be uniformly applied across the state, if educators are having trouble interpreting like what does this mean? What is considered education? What are these guidelines? What are these policies that are being required of me? If they can't make sense of them, then it's going to lead to uneven application and inconsistent implementation across the state. So moving over to the process, right now, the minimum standards are in two different oversight committees, and it's kind of it's kind of moving at the same time. I will say that as of 11:40-ish, one of the oversight committees actually took a vote, so that work is being closed. But the two oversight committees that these rules have gone through or are going through are the Legislative Oversight Committee on Educational Improvement and Assessment, which we will for now call the Legislative Oversight Committee, and the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Administrative Rules, which is affectionately known as JLCAR. So they have very different functions. The Legislative Oversight Committee serves as lawmakers' insight and input into the minimum standards for public school approval. Since state law gives the New Hampshire Department of Education the authority and duty to adopt these minimum standards, the Legislative Oversight Committee is one of the ways that lawmakers can engage in the process. They're specific to education. They look at the policy. They review and make recommendations to proposals. They are made up of education committee members, whether that's in the Senate Education Committee or in the House Education Committee. So these folks are really dialed in. And so they're pretty well versed in education statute and the role that the legislature should play in the rulemaking process. JLCAR, on the other hand, is an overarching body that reviews and votes on all administrative rule proposals, not just education. They're looking at DHHS. They're looking at Fish and Game. They're looking at all of the state agencies, all of the administrative rule proposals. They don't review whether a rule is good or bad policy. They actually have a very specific set of grounds in which they can consider. And that includes the fiscal impact, whether the proposed rule is within the authority of the agency, and two others that I'll talk about in a little bit. But their function is really to make sure that the rules follow state law, that they're clear, and that they can be applied uniformly. That is critical when we're talking about administrative rules. One of the most important things that makes a rule a good rule is whether or not it can be uniformly applied, whether or not it's universally understood. You read a rule and my interpretation of it is the same as somebody else's. It's written in a way that's clear, that's concise, and that can be easily understood. So JLCAR does take a formal vote on whether to accept or object the rules. So the Legislative Oversight Committee, their role is to review a proposal and recommend changes and that kind of thing. JLCAR accepts or objects to rules, right? So they have some power in the timeline. If they vote to object, it delays the implementation of the rule, but ultimately they can't stop the state board of the Department of Education from implementing the rule, but what they can do is delay. So if they object, they can raise objections. They can have a back and forth with the agency, and they come, they vote, and they say, "Yep, these rules look great." They pass all of our checks, or they say, "Ooh, we're seeing some significant problems here, so we're going to object." So starting with the Legislative Oversight Committee, they've been meeting for a couple of weeks now. They've raised substantial concerns with numerous parts of the rule proposal, including the removal of maximum class sizes, including the expanded definition of educator, academic standards, graduation requirements, school facilities, and the impacts on school funding. They've raised a number of other ones too, but those are kind of the big overarching themes that they've been discussing over the past few weeks. It is important to note, though, that as of about an hour ago, they did vote along party lines to vote to accept the state boards with a couple of minor tweaks. But we're seeing where last week there was some pretty significant concerns with some of these areas. This week, they ultimately voted along party lines. to accept the rule proposal. So that news is hot off the press. So thanks for joining us, because first to know. So the Legislative Oversight Committee, it's my understanding that now their work is done. They won't be meeting anymore on the minimum standards. They do have other duties regarding education that they meet on, but their work in the minimum standards appears at this moment to be done. So jail car, that the Committee on Administrative Rules, I talked about them having 4 buckets of where they consider those are in the public interest. Are the rules in the public interest? Do the rules have a financial cost that was not outlined in the rule proposal? Do the rules adhere with legislative intent? This is really important. So the legislature, lawmakers have to give agencies the authority to adopt rules. And so those rules have to be adopted in a way that the legislature meant. So one of the key things that JailCar has to do is to ensure that rule proposals align with the legislative intent that gave them the authority to do that. And then the 4th one is, are they beyond the authority of the agency? You know, when lawmakers said you have to adopt rules for X, Y, and Z, are those rules within that scope? So that's also something that's extremely important. So we've been talking with a number of folks and who have been involved in this process for years now, right? And so I wanted to highlight some of the themes of the concerns within these 4 buckets. Okay, so in the public interest, are these within the public interest? We've heard that hundreds of pages of public feedback in opposition of the proposal. You know, we've heard that they are unclear and they're ambiguous and they could lead to inconsistent application, right? So those are some of the examples of, are they in the public interest that JailCar may consider when they meet in November? The financial cost. We've heard concerns that the removal of detail could have unclear costs for districts, and that mandating the adoption of curriculum frameworks could add a financial pressure to school districts, right? For legislative intent, those graduation requirements, do they align with RSA? There were a number of areas with the personal finance literacy, with their logic and rhetoric, where do those actually align with RSA? It's unclear at the moment. And really in the delivery of an adequate education, right? The minimum standards for public school approval are intended to state how the delivery of an adequate education is in New Hampshire. And so one of the concerns that we are hearing, one of the concerns that we've talked with multiple folks about is, does this align with the change from, you know, the inputs to essentially what are academic standards? Does that align with the legislative intent of what the minimum standards actually are and what they need to be? And beyond authority, we've had questions asked of us, and I'm unclear on these. I will be very honest. Does the New Hampshire Department of Education have the authority to mandate curriculum frameworks? Right? We see in the state law that curriculum frameworks are supposed to serve as a guide, and so one of the questions that we're hearing is, can the department mandate them? And can the department use state academic standards to set the criteria for a substantive public education instead of the inputs-based system that they're using now? And so one of the other things that I really want to highlight in this section is that, you know, the details and the specificity, you know, would be removed and eroded in favor of generalities that leave much open to interpretation. That is directly from the quote that we heard earlier, right? There is a lot of ambiguity. There is a lot of confusion in the field. And that's really important when we're thinking about every single one of these areas, right? I think one of the things that we're seeing in legislative oversight committees, in conversations, you know, with the state board and things like that, is that, you know, when there's ambiguity, when people say, hey, why is it written like this? They get an answer on background that's, oh, well, this is why. And then they kind of come back and say, okay, well, this person said this is why, so we're good with that. But the point of a rule is to introduce some clarity so that these can be uniformly applied. And so that's something that we are seeing consistently, of this lack of uniformity, this lack of clarity. So in terms of where JAILCAR is, they've tabled the quote first half, which is everything up to those content area standards, until the committee receives that second half, which is the content area standards, so that they can consider the complete proposal. Their next meeting is on November 21st, and that will likely be in the Legislative Office Building in Concord. It's unclear. They haven't introduced an agenda yet, but the meeting will be on November 21st. We are expecting them to take up a vote on both sections at that meeting. JAILCAR does accept public comment. Unlike standing committees like the House Education Committee, the Senate Education Committee, you don't necessarily go in, take a pink card, and then you're guaranteed the right to speak. JAILCAR operates a little bit differently, but one thing that they do accept is written testimony. So we've seen folks who have written to JAILCAR members, and we've seen some of that being discussed at the meetings. So for folks who are wanting to get involved, that is one way. That is one way that we've seen that folks have been getting involved, is by writing to the committee. And that would be before November 21st. So with that, I think we can move it over to questions. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Christina. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. It was very thorough. I learned things too. The minimum standards are very complicated and very complex, and this has been a very long process. So thank you for very succinctly pulling it together. We do have some questions. I'm going to start first with a couple questions regarding class ratio. So would this proposal, would this educator ratio formula, the proposal, allow them to have one online teacher reviewing the work of 100 online students?
Yeah, so that's an open question, right? So if you read the plain text of them, of the rules, the ratio is, it's a calculation, right? And in another part of the rules, it's you have to have enough staff to meet the educator student ratio. So I think, I showed the picture earlier. That is one interpretation of a student educator ratio. And with the expanded definition of educator, that is something that is a real concern of, could this lead to a much significantly larger class sizes? And that's something that we've heard in the state board of, some state board members saying, hey, maybe it's okay to have lecture style things in the auditorium, these classes with larger things. Kids have to get used to it if they're going to go to higher ed. And so that is something that we're watching really, really closely.
Awesome. Also regarding the class ratio, has the state board expressed why they want to move and make this change from set class sizes to a ratio formula?
That's a great question. So they have had a number of conversations about it at meetings. Much of them have been sparked by some of the public concerns. And I think, we haven't gotten a really direct answer as to why. Some of the things that we've heard have been, well, the way that it's written, our proposal gives schools the flexibility to have smaller class sizes. But if you look at the current rule, like they do, the maximum class sizes is 25 students or fewer, or 30 students or fewer. So that doesn't really add up. We haven't gotten a very clear answer and a very direct answer as to why. And given the magnitude of the public pushback on this specific rule, it raises a lot of questions of if they're saying, oh, it's not really going to be a change in practice, it means the same thing. I've heard a lot of people ask me, well, then why don't they just change it back to the language that it was? And we haven't gotten a clear answer for that.
Okay. On content area standards, can you explain how the terms academic standards and program are defined in the rules? What is the difference between academic standards and programs? Doesn't the proposed draft of the back half redirect the definition of an adequate education from delivering programs to being compliant with outdated state standards?
Yeah, that's a great and very nuanced question that I'm going to try my best to answer in a succinct way. So right now the way that the minimum standards are set out is that schools have to offer programs, and those programs have to have certain things. They have to have systemic instruction. They have to have planned curriculum. They have to have sound assessment practices. And there's some details in terms of what those programs have to include, right? It doesn't have anything to do with what a student has to learn. Those are academic standards. Those are very different. Those are in different documents. They are in different parts of statute. Those set out what students have to learn, like what they learn and should be able to do. So that's like from the student perspective, this is the information that's going into my brain, right? Schools have to do both. Like they have to offer programs that have certain pieces and certain elements, and they have to teach certain things that align with academic standards and that kind of thing, right? What we're seeing is that the program requirements of this is what a program is, has been stripped away. And so now all we're left with is this is what a student has to learn. But the rules don't say how, right? They don't say this is what this is what the program has to include in order for the student to learn that kind of thing. And this is really important when we're talking about school funding, right? Because if you're only talking about what a student has to learn and you're not setting basic requirements on what a school has to offer, then what does the state have to fund, right? Like, do they have to fund a program? Do they have to fund, a pod? What do they have to fund? Because we're not saying what the program is. And so that's kind of a really big difference. I really hope I answered that question succinctly, but that's the best I got.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Also relative to content area standards, it sounds as if ensuring access translates directly into outside purveyors of programming available for a price. Is that a reasonable assessment?
I think that is a real concern. What does ensuring access mean? It is a very subtle shift in language, but I think it's one that will have significant impacts in terms of what a school is responsible to do. If you have, if you have a Learn Everywhere program in your course description, in your program guidebook, does that count as ensuring access? There are a lot of questions in terms of what does ensuring access mean, because it seems significantly different than providing a program.
Perfect. Thank you. Relative to course offerings, can you say more about how the removal of the required course offerings changes the New Hampshire graduation requirements? If a school does not offer all of the courses required to graduate, what does that mean? Does a student get to earn a diploma anyway, or are they just not able to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are kind of cross references to rules where schools have to offer a certain number of courses, and they have to offer opportunities for students to achieve competencies in those areas. But it's pretty light on the details in terms of how exactly they have to do that. Whereas right now there's a lot of we have a lot of detail. You have to offer 43 courses in certain areas. You have to have 3 art courses. You have to have X amount. And so I think that's another area where it is really ambiguous of, okay, well, what does it mean then? Like, what does a school actually have to provide? What are we on the hook for? And so that's another concern. And when we think about equity of opportunity across the state, and access to courses and that kind of thing, that's a big question.
We have two questions relative to competency-based education. So I'm going to read them both to you.
Okay.
Um, I have a concern that little educational research in the area of competency-based teaching and learning, instruction, and assessment was used as a guideline by the state board in changing the rules. As a CBE expert, much of the input given to strengthen the existing standards was overlooked. Can this be addressed in any fashion moving forward? Connected to that question, we have another attendee who's asking to what extent are the changes that are being proposed driven by the desire to implement competency-based education, which looks at outcomes more than programs?
Yeah, these are both excellent questions. And I'm going to answer the first one first. I mean, the second one first, because the first one does a great job of kind of setting up those things. So at the very beginning of this stage, right? At the very beginning of this process several years ago, there was a big push of, we're aligning this with competency-based education and those kinds of things. But through the process, we've heard experts in competency-based education, experts in, program design, that what has come out and what's been in the standards isn't reflective of what we know about competency-based education and what we know works. There's decades of research. There are folks even on this webinar right now that know a tremendous amount about competency-based education, what it takes to make it work. But their input hasn't been taken into account. And so whether the intent is to move more towards a competency-based education system, whether to actualize the state's existing vision of competency-based education in New Hampshire, even if that's the intent, we're seeing experts say that the current rules, that's not what's happening. And we're seeing that the department and the state board are resistant to hearing feedback from experts in terms of what would make these rules better achieve that goal of a competency-based system. We have heard significant flaws in terms of some of the very specific pieces of the minimum standards, but they haven't been addressed. So what we're seeing is, a set of proposed rules that, instead of advancing a competency-based education vision for New Hampshire, actually undermines competency-based education because it doesn't include some of the key elements that we know makes the system work.
Thank you for that, Christina. In
Sure.
our last minute before we let everybody go, I wonder if you could just tell folks what to expect from us, and where they can go for more information or next steps.
Absolutely. So we will be posting this on YouTube. You'll get a recording in your email inbox shortly once it's uploaded. It usually takes between 24 and 48 hours, probably because my computer's slow. But we will include in that email a copy of the slides and the contact information for folks if you want to reach out to any of the committees. And it will also be posted on our website, PDF of the slides and a video recording. So reachinghighernh.org.
Fabulous. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kelly.